to another episode of What Works, a series of conversations about life's biggest challenges and questions. So we invite different people who have different experiences and knowledge about how to handle this crazy thing called life. So today we have Jim Wilson with us. Hi, Jim.
Hello, Johnny.
Hello. So this is the thing when you're describing someone else, you know you're not going to make sense to the other. So I'm just going to read a little line that I see on one of your books, and I have a suggestion after that how to continue. But just like a little picture of who you seem to be, Jim. This is what is on the back of one of your books. Jim Wilson has worked within the National Health Service for over 20 years, first in his homeland, Scotland, and then England and Wales. He started off as a social worker and then specialized in family therapy and systemic therapy. Okay, so far so good.
Yes, that's about right.
so let me try a different way of seeing who you are. So I have three things I want to put up in front of the camera, and I'm interested in seeing how you relate to them. So just if you want to share what shows up, so that would be interesting. So because I have an image of Jim, but I don't know, maybe you have another image, probably. So the first of the three objects is this one. So how do you relate to this?
Well, there's it's quite a powerful message, because the pedagogy of the oppressed was, of course, Paulo Freire's work, and I discovered Freire kind of later in my career. Can I tell you a story about it?
Yeah, please.
Well, there's two things. Well, I'll tell you the image of the gun that's wrapped as it is. I have a very close friend who's an artist, and one of he exhibits his work, they're like sculptures, or one of his pieces is a gun that he had poetic words coming out of this gun instead of bullets. And that image reminded me of David Garner's work that he exhibits in Wales. He's quite a famous Welsh installation artist, so if you ever want to check him out, David Garner's. And it just the image was very much like one of David's illustrations. Now the story that you reminded me of with the picture and the name of the book, it goes back years ago when I was working in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, as you'll be aware, was in a very difficult political situation with what was called euphemistically the Troubles, which is basically sectarian violence and almost like a civil war. Anyway, when I went there, the worst of the shooting and killing was ending, and the peace process was beginning. But I was teaching in Northern Ireland, and this man came up to me and said, "Have you read any Paulo Freire's work?" And I said, "No, I never heard of Paulo Freire." And he said, "Because I think the way that you're teaching is the way that Freire talks about education." And which was a complete fluke. And I mean, I have no, I had no influence at that time by Freire, but I subsequently read his works, and it began to inform a kind of value base for my therapy. Incrementally over a period of time, it began to inform how I thought we should orientate ourselves towards a process of humanization. Therapy should be part of that process, and that means that not only is the work done in a certain dignified, respectful and wherever possible, a collaborative enterprise. But the process involves the humanization as a relational feature. It's not just the clients find some way to be more fully human. The therapist learns in the process. And that idea has stuck with me over the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
That's the first one.
Yeah, there's a lots more to investigate around what you're saying now, but we might get back to that. So that's one side of you, Jim, where something influenced you. So let me show you another object. See how you relate to this.
Oh, I resonate with that. That's a joke. That's a guitarist joke. Yeah, the resonator guitar. I've got one of them at home in Wales. Of course, the thing about the resonator was that they developed the steel guitar because people were singing acoustically out in the fresh air, and it was about volume. Some of the subtlety of playing doesn't come across with a resonator, but I love those guitars.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the obvious connection for me is the whole. Well, it ties in a bit with the earlier points about the pedagogy of the oppressed, because I think if we think of our practice as a co-creative process, the analogy that always comes to my mind is it's a bit like when you're playing a musical instrument with other musicians, and you need to leave space for their creativity, and that what is developed between the musicians that are playing together should be a kind of process whereby they play to enhance the music, not to enhance the musician.
Yeah.
And that's always struck me as something that's really important for family therapists or any practice, really. You know, it's if it's a relational process, that is the foreground to what we're doing.
Yeah.
So I might play the guitar and accompany a singer like I did last night.
Yeah.
And I'm not playing to compete with the singer. I'm trying to play a kind of, if you like, a counterpoint or something that supplements or augments what she's singing.
Yeah.
But you sometimes, and I've done this myself, we've all made these mistakes, you sometimes get carried away with your own playing, and you're thinking, well, this is a good solo, but you've lost touch with the audience and B with the other musicians.
And you look up and everybody's looking at you and wonder what you're doing.
That's right. And it's a bit like, it's the analogy that we were talking about earlier, about when a therapist falls in love with the language of the therapy modality but fails to connect with the clients. I think it's the same kind of, it's a basic systemic error if you talk in the language that people don't understand.
Yeah. So that was funny. So the last object in the kind of looking a little bit of for those who never met you or listened to you to hear where you're coming from. So the third is this object.
Yeah. The birds in the cage. Yeah, that to me, that image stays with me very much. It was painted actually by the partner of the artist I just mentioned. This sounds like I'm plugging my friend's art. I don't mean to, you can edit that out. But I told her I wanted something about creativity.
So just in case somebody's just listening and not seeing this, the picture, could you describe what we're looking at?
We're looking at birds escaping from a cage, but if you look at it very closely, the cage, the metal strands of the cage actually are in the birds that are leaving until the last bird, the last three birds, are flying free of those imprisoned constraints that seems to be pulling them back.
Mm.
And it was an image that I think said a lot about my experience of working in the mental health service in the latter part of maybe from the last 10 years, or maybe even before that, where it seemed to me that not just family therapists, this is a more generic kind of issue, that people were becoming more and more confined to procedures and policies and bureaucratization and commodification, that they were becoming regimented into following certain pathways, some of which were very, very helpful, I have to say. But they were feeling that the professionalism was beginning to become more and more constricted, so that instead of having the freedom to fly in directions that would have been more in tune with their clients, their patients, they shaped their practice in ways that, for some, objectified the clients or pathologized the clients or talked about deficiencies in the clients. And so it was an interaction that was about a kind of instruction as to who had the right way to proceed and who was the recipient of that way to proceed, rather than something that is more exploratory. And so the book, the last book, which I was so pleased it was published by Student Literature in Sweden. I was really delighted about that. Was my attempt to kind of open up not only those limitations for discussion, which had gone underground in many places. We don't talk about it because we want to keep our job, which is also understandable. But to begin to have a debate. But the other part of it was to really ask the question, which I know you're interested in, Johnny, with your podcast, is what keeps us going? What keeps us wanting to develop? What keeps therapists wanting to contribute so that we don't lose heart? What are the features that really make for development in the face of constraints, and also sometimes because of the constraints? So you get limitations, and limitations can either suffocate you, or you can find friends and colleagues and ideas that help you to kind of come through that, like the birds coming out of the cage, so that the constraint actually pushes you to do something different.
Is it possible to give some kind of example out of your practice or your experience, how to exemplify what you're saying now? I see your hands doing like this and this. What does that mean in everyday work for a social worker, for example?
I think there's it's a very good question, and it's a big question, so trying to do it justice. I think there are different levels at which people can make contributions that enhance the process of humanization that I referred to earlier. And sometimes the small details, the small possibilities go unnoticed, because people think we need to have a total transformation of the system, which, many of us may believe that is also the case. But that doesn't diminish the small acts of activism, and I mean that also contribute to a sense of a process of humanization in our practice. And that's not a way to excuse not doing things. I don't mean that at all. But I think one has to look at practice as a set of possibilities in whatever context you're in. So sometimes in my practice, the engagement with the clients might take quite some time to make a good connection. But I'm working at that all the time. Small details of connection, small moves that eventually gather, gather a pace. And then you get to a point where you're able to work together in a more exploratory way. So those very small beginnings are really very important. And that's in the therapy room or the home visit or whatever.
Yeah.
When it comes to organizational features of limitation, I think it creates ethical dilemmas for therapists and practitioners. And it runs a bit like this. In that book, I remember it was a Swedish colleague who said, the most important question is to ask myself, do I recognize myself in the job that I am doing? Profound and very wonderfully straightforward Swedish thinking. No pussyfooting about there. And I think that was one of the main reasons that I wrote the last book about creativity, because I needed to see if I was doing a job that I still believed in, and I still felt was authentic, and I was being true to myself and the values that I brought into my job 40 years ago as a social worker. And I didn't want to compromise that. So I think there are many debates to be had when people are working in agencies, that they feel, do I really recognize myself in the job I'm doing, or am I doing something that it's incongruous in some way, it doesn't fit in some way with what I came into this profession to do? And I think that's a big question for
That's a big question, but it's also really a practical question. You can try and start a revolution with that kind of question, but you can also start with just asking, do I believe in what I'm doing?
Yes, and can you have conversations about that? And can you begin to generate conversations? I think in order not to be despondent, and some people lose heart and they leave, they start private business and they leave the National Health Service, or they're morally exhausted, and so I'm not excusing any of that. In fact, that's appalling waste of skill and ability. It's terrible, and that does need a political response that's much more comprehensive. But we're talking about right now about the individual practitioner getting through, and there's a lovely little example. It's another Swedish example. When I worked in Kalmar some years ago, and I was teaching there, and people were studying ways to develop their practice with young people and children in a family therapy systemic kind of way. And one young psychologist said, this is over 18 months, 6 or 7 times I went for 3 days at a time. So it was quite intensive. Said, we're really enjoying this. And when we're here together, we get lots of ideas about how to improve our practice. But I've noticed that when we go back into the day-to-day work, a lot of that disappears. And I really need to think about why that's so. And they said this, and I think these are really key things. One said, well, I think what we need to do to continue is to share our practice, so that our practice is shared between us. It becomes something that's more discussable. It's something that's more supported by one another, even if we disagree. We need to share our practice. Another said, well, I certainly need to do that. I need to open my door to invite other colleagues in to talk with me about, whatever aspect of practice they want to discuss. So keeping it on that professional kind of methodological or conceptual level. Another one said, well, that's true, we do need to do that, but we also need to open up our minds to other ways of thinking, rather than just being in our own little kind of our own little nice, comfortable group that all agrees, they all agree together what we should do and how we should think, and we've got the truth. We've got the truth. We're the good guys. And then this other person said, yeah, we need to open the doors, open our practice, open our minds, but we also need to open our hearts. And that was very profound, because what this person was saying was that we need to talk about the times when we feel vulnerable, when we don't know what to do next, when we've had a very difficult session with a client, like a young person who might feel like killing themselves. These are these are not just professional responses about procedures and methods and risk assessments. This is about how you are affected by your work and how you can use that to begin to talk with a colleague rather than take it home in your head and develop psychosomatic symptoms or whatever. So those four, that little simple story, I think, has within it the gems of what really counts. You can't short circuit that. People need time to think about their practice and to talk about it without being self-indulgent. You know, it's not about navel gazing, you know, it's about doing something that's going to enhance the service you give to your patients.
Yeah. So
that's
beautiful. That's really says a lot. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking, when you came to that part of opening your heart and you were talking about vulnerability, then you're in this really human dimension. So I was, let's see what your thoughts are about this, because whether you're a therapist or you're a client or you're just somebody in pain, my basic assumption from this question is that there is no possibility to control life. What you and Jim, we don't have a clue what's going to happen in 5 minutes. If we're actually really basic, we don't know what's going to happen. I might drop dead in a second here. So what?
I hope not. I would spoil the podcast.
Would spoil it. Would be a pretty boring conversation for you, but it would be dramatic. I'd probably get a lot of viewers if that happened. But what I was trying to connect to was when you open your heart, you become vulnerable to life's dynamic input all the time, and what seems to be happening, whether you're a professional or a client or just the human level of it, that we go instantly to control.
Yeah.
Whether it's a couple or a family or a professional group or an organization or a nation, this seems to become a habit that we all reinforce. Let's control the situation. Let's do some kind of, and we still always get the feedback that it's not working. Life will always turn itself around in some way we hadn't predicted. And then we feel we're more vulnerable and try to control even more. Maybe that's to simplify things, but when you say that, how do you find a way to be vulnerable without being scared or going into controlling?
I think that there's again so much to that. I think partly this is where capacity, everybody's capacity, but I'm talking just in terms of my professional activity. We try, don't we, to develop an ability to reflect in action about our experience with the other person. And we try the best way we can to, so to speak, utilize vulnerability. If I'm feeling vulnerable, there's also a part of me in a way that's kind of curious about why I'm feeling vulnerable. So I think when, for example, I'm thinking about a young person I worked with some years ago, and she was writing a letter to an abuser, somebody who physically abused her when she was much younger. And this person was out of her life a long time, but she still needed to get this out about what she felt about this person. So after a lot of kind of discussion, she agreed that we could write a letter to this person. And she said, "No, I don't want to write a letter." And I said, "Well, I can write. I can be your secretary if you be my boss. So you dictate and I'll write it." And it was like it was a difficult process because this was a very quiet, rather withdrawn young person. So she was kind of coming out of her shell. And we were writing this letter to this person, this dead person who was the abuser. And at one point, the girl said, I hated it when you made me wear I hated it when I had to wear winter clothes in the summer. And I paused and I said, why did you have to wear winter clothes in the summer? It's kind of naive question. And she said, because it covered all the bruises, and at that point I could feel the tears come. Because it was such a childlike, matter-of-fact thing that she said, and it really touched me. So you could say I felt vulnerable at that point because I was moved by that, but I hadn't reflected on this. It just came. But in the tears also came an appreciation that this was a very big, important voicing of this child's secrets. So the vulnerability and the kind of appreciation of its merit in the context of her saying that meant I didn't collapse in a heap. You can recognize your vulnerability, and somehow the vulnerability becomes part of that relational domain, that conversational domain, if that makes sense.
It does.
So
it does make sense. Yeah.
That's at a very small level, I think.
So from a human point of view, it's kind of like when I'm listening to you that the professional gym and the private gym kind of met each other.
Yeah.
Through the voicing of her story.
I think that's a very good one.
And it's okay to feel that, not to be scared. Wouldn't you say that's a part of being in a culture where we don't have our own voicing of our own reactions? So it kind of becomes like, well, now I have this problem that I want to cry in when I'm meeting people. What's wrong with me?
Yeah.
I'm not like the others. So
I think that's I think that one of the changes that has happened in the family therapy world that I grew up in is that we moved from the head to the heart. And we moved into a much more appreciation of multisensorial connection with people. And I think, to be fair, I think the work of Tom Anderson and Jaakko Seikkula and many others, but they come to mind, John Shorter, kind of helped to give a kind of stability to that idea that we weren't technicians, that we weren't just following circular processes and making interventions and stuff like that. We were doing that, but we were human beings in lived experience that is better informed to use technique. That's the irony. It's not about not using technique or not using, giving people advice, and that's not the issue. The issue is about how you connect.
Yeah,
that's the fundament. That's it. And to do that, it's a multisensorial connection. Daniel Stern writes about this. It's not just about thoughts or affects or interactions. It's about the whole kind of composite of being with another person, or in our work, being on the stage of family therapy, where you're having to connect with multiple actors, so to speak. So vulnerability to me is it happens, and therefore it's happening because it's a systemic phenomenon. It's a relational phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make me a bad therapist if I find myself being very moved. What would make me a bad therapist is if I became self-indulgent about why I was being moved, and I started talking about my, something that happened in my life, and my clients they're thinking, we're not here to talk about
therapist do. Now I'm feeling sad too.
We're here to talk about me. That would be a very bad mistake.
So when we're talking about different places, let's stay in that vulnerable space, because when I'm listening to you, I find that I'm curious to see how the word, this is in Swedish, so it says kreativitet, which is creativity. And
Yeah.
I'm curious about when if we take a step back to this kind of theme of how do we handle life's biggest challenges, whatever kind of shape or form they show up. There seems to be one part of it is that we have to face some kind of vulnerability. So what's your obsession with creativity, Jim, then? How do you connect that? Because I hear some kind of connection, but what's your view on how is creativity connected to the sometimes the places where you don't feel creative at all, when it's totally lost and you feel hopeless and vulnerable and wrong and have no idea what to do? Where does creativity fit in this?
For me, it connects a bit to the earlier points we were discussing about limitations and experiencing limitations and either getting lost in them or how we decide to do something in response to the limitations. And I think the same thing perhaps goes when we're facing periods of hopelessness and no idea what to do. It's it's an existential, it's a real challenge in our lives. And from my own so I'm not talking professionally here, talking personally, what got me through times of hopelessness when the world was turned upside down some nearly 30 years ago now. What got me through that was a kind of day-to-day decision that I would be able to get up, then I'd be able to have breakfast, I'd be able to go to work, I'd be able to. So I broke down the challenges into manageable pieces. That's what I did for myself.
Yeah.
In terms of my, what got me through that, it was back to these things that we talked about earlier. It was supportive friendships. It was people who didn't judge. It was people who could appreciate what you were going through. And the pain had to be endured. And I think, Gawande talks about this in his book I've got here somewhere. This book. Oh no, that's Gadamer. Wrong. Here we are. I brought these books to France because I'm writing another short book at the minute, and I brought all these books over with me. This one, Being Mortal, by Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. And it's a very good read. He's not a family therapist, but he says things that are universally relevant. The most important thing is when our patients feel that we are conscientious, that we're consistent, that we're there, we're compassionate, the C's, and I think those are the very fundamental things that help people get through a crisis. They need to feel that somebody is there you can count on, that you maybe don't agree with, or they maybe debate with you, or they tell you off or something like that, but you're counting on them. Yeah. And I noticed that when I was working in the child and adolescent service in London, actually that was the most important thing for a lot of teenagers. In addition to the, good therapy service and provision of maybe a psychiatric oversight or whatever. But the thing that the young people talked about was that you were there when we didn't feel we felt hopeless. You were still there, and you kept the sessions going. You didn't let me drop out. So I think.
Do you have any clue how because that I'm quite aware of that there's no one answer, but when you talk about it like that, that you were there, you didn't let them drop out. What do you know about the way you meet someone that is helpful? What are you doing? What do they mean when they say that? What are you doing?
Yeah. I think I can only say the experience I have is that you see beyond the protest. You know, if they're saying, I don't want to be here, or life's hopeless, or I can't go on, that you hear in the inflections. And I'm not sure that, I think that's something that maybe comes with practice, but I think it's a natural ability that we have when I call it hearing the music in the words, you know. They say that this is hopeless, and you think, okay, this is hopeless, but there's something here that makes me feel gently and slowly. We agree it's hopeless, but it's not that hopeless. And I think sometimes what goes between the clients and the therapist is this unspoken acknowledgement that what we're saying to each other about hopelessness is indeed felt as hopeless. I'm not minimizing it, but there's another chord, there's another piece of music in there as well, which you pick up in your ear, or you pick up in your body, or you sense it. You know, when a young person says, I just want to leave here and kill myself, I just feel awful, and you know, this is really difficult. And then you're able to say, our appointment is next Wednesday, and you get a nod. Well, you know that you've heard the hopelessness, but you've also heard the message that they're going to come back. And I think you go in that sense of trying to read the ambience, the atmospheric, the gut reaction, but also the kind of intellectual process of figuring out if your gut reaction is accurate or you're deluding yourself. And often when you're not sure, that's when you need a colleague. Yeah. And you need to talk to colleagues. I'm not sure about that young person. So I think hopelessness is a context. And it's a very important context. And so, you know, remember the old Milan school days where they would observe a family where people were all quite depressed, and the therapist within 5 minutes was as depressed as the family members. So they have to haul the therapist out so he didn't get completely down to introduce something new. And so I think that's one of the beauties of, I think, a systemic orientation, is not to think all the expertise is somehow embodied in the therapist, but it's a relational process, including the clients.
Yeah, it's a relational process, and it's some kind of human connection that whatever we're doing with method and techniques, there's always the human soundtrack in the room, and whether we listen to it or not, it's kind of part of the culture or the context, what expectations we have on ourselves. So that's one part of the cage, maybe, that we're being told not to listen to the human dimension, or go up to the head and do some kind of method or manual, which are good, but are tools, not so let me see if I can keep the key but change the tune.
Go ahead.
Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
So
please do.
So that's in the we're going roller coaster here, Jim. So let me know if you're getting dizzy, but we're in the really human subtle connection, and now I want to shift to the kind of more broader way. So I was thinking before this conversation if I could find some kind of context for this question that is from my own life. So this is not from my own life, but from my own place of living. So this part of Sweden where I'm in, called Gävleborg, there are three. This is a puzzle. I know only 4 pieces. So I want to share those pieces with you and see how you fit them together. Each puzzle is not just a random statistic. This is patterns that seem to show up year after year where I live.
Right.
So and I just to be sure, I checked the statistics, and when I have some kind of source of what I'm saying, not just a hunch.
Yes.
So this is based, a lot of the things I will say now is actually based from a really scary place when you translate it into English. It's called the Bureau of Central Statistics.
Okay.
It's a Swedish place.
Yeah, we have them.
About health issues and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff. So, and there's some other sources, but I'm not going to go into figures. I just want to show the puzzle, the pieces of the puzzle, to see how they make sense to you. So where I'm living, in this part of Sweden, we have one of the highest divorce levels. That's one puzzle. That's one piece of the puzzle. We have the number one highest level of ADHD diagnosis, medicated diagnosis, boys and girls. Boys are really sky high, but the girls are also nationally on the top levels.
Right.
And we are one of them with the lowest education level in Sweden.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And high unemployment. So we got 4 pieces. There's maybe a lot of other pieces in this puzzle, but I just picked those out because how do you make sense of that? There's a lot of stories you can do with those pieces in just in the way you put them in a linear story.
Yes.
What's the cause? What's the effect? Yes. Stuff like that. So how what's your reaction to those pieces?
Did you, just before we go on, did you say this is Gothenburg you're talking about?
Oh yeah, Gävleborg. It's
Gävle. Oh, Gävle outside Stockholm.
Gävle.
Gävle. Yeah, I know Gävle.
Yeah,
yeah.
I know. I met you in Gävle once.
Yeah. Was it Gävle we met? Was it?
Yeah.
God. Okay. This is such a big question.
I know.
Let's take the issue of impoverishment, of poverty and unemployment in the lowest education level. These dimensions of people's lives, we know, profoundly affect their psychosocial lives. That's given. It's a given. And there's in the United Kingdom, there's an appalling resurgence of impoverishment, and the distinction and the difference between those that are the most poor and those that are the richest is a massive difference. So there are issues about how one's political system maintains that or not. That's number one. I grew up in the welfare state. I mean, I'm a product of the welfare state in that I came from a working class family, had the opportunity to be educated. My parents we didn't suffer financially. We lived in a council estate, a regular council estate. But I was the first generation to be educated and to be able to have the luck of having a life that I've thoroughly enjoyed so far. But all those generations before, those people had equal potential to develop, to do various things, to feel satisfied, but they didn't because they were poor and they were working in factories and they were ground down and they were in places where their views didn't matter very much, or generations before, the women didn't have the vote, so on and so forth. So we cannot, it would be naive to separate off the political from the personal experience of a person's life. So these are massive problems of high unemployment, low education level. They often go together. I mean, and then if people are docile, if they are taught to never ask questions or never articulate their arguments, that's a good way to keep the status quo going. So these are profoundly political questions for me. At the level of the ADHD, I mean, well, you and I both know how this has become an epidemic. And I think it's symptomatic of a medical and psychiatric profession that has monopolized the definition of social distress and has, in the main, located it inside some kind of internal process in children or a constitution or their brain patterns or something like this. That's not to say some children are very busy. I'm not, and they're active, and I'm not. We're all different in that respect. But what I think is maybe a pattern that connects these things is a kind of objectification that the problem is out there. It's somebody else has to do it. So the working class should get up. In Britain, we have 1 million vacancies for jobs at the minute. And so the idea is all the jobs that have been lost during the pandemic and through Brexit, all these people can just go and fill these other jobs, which is a completely naive formula for thinking about how you help people to be educated and reskilled and develop. And I think I think in Britain anyway, we're living in a society where the idea of treating people humanely when they're unemployed, when they're poorly educated, is in danger of somehow being objectifying of those people, so that the problem seems to be their fault. You're lazy. You should get off your backside and go and find work. And that kind of rhetoric, I think, is becoming stronger.
So lazy is I find lazy is of course there's a lot of levels of political and social, but lazy is you can defend yourself easier about that if you don't think you're lazy. But if somebody says, well, you got something wrong with your brain,
yes,
how do you defend yourself if the one who says that has a lot of education that you don't have? And you have to trust someone. Where do you go when you break your leg? Or so I'm talking from a position that I know the people working in psychiatry, schools, and social welfare. We all want to do something good for the people in front of us. So I'm not talking about that someone is right or wrong, but the when we're talking about Gävle, is it something in our blood, or is it in our DNA? Where it's so easy that the conversation starts with the symptoms.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
And of course, there are kids, boys and girls, and parents and professionals that are confused with this. So how do you find a way to interact without becoming the other?
Yeah, I think there's the, I mean, to go back to Freire where we began the discussion. I mean, Freire also makes the point that inside the oppressed is the oppressor. This is a very interesting. So that you're right, I think, to say that we need, if we get into us and them, just into us and them, it doesn't mean to say we can't debate and disagree and have passionate views about somebody in opposition to you. Righteous anger is part of making a creative stand for things. But I think we also need to recognize that, there can be the oppressor inside the oppressed. And so when we're talking about finding a way to work with people, back to me, to think about how we connect with their humanity and the possibilities, to be curious, to try and open up the conversation. So the ADHD thing is a fantastic example, because in the health service of which I worked in London, only 4 of my clients out of 3 years there ever took methylphenidate. right? 4 of the children that were referred for ADHD, 4, because we skipped in the back door. They didn't, we talked to the psychiatrist, said, no, we're doing with this. So sometimes one has to be a bit strategic, and sometimes a bit, dare I say it, I'm not prescribing this, but think about creativity as a little bit of delinquency sometimes.
Well, explain what you mean by delinquency.
Not following the rules.
Ah.
Decide it, but you've got to be careful you don't get sacked. But but unless you want to leave, of course. But I think compliance, always agreeing with the policies, I think that makes us docile beings if we really don't believe in those things. So the ADHD example, of course, presumably the dominant procedure in Yavle is where psychiatrists are having to prescribe drugs all the time. And the psychiatrists often say, we've got nothing else we can do. There's so many referrals, and this is what we can offer because people need help. But of course, what that does, as you know, is that it streamlines a way of thinking about a person's social psychological context into the taking of a tablet once a day.
Yeah.
When people are living in impoverished conditions, high unemployment, high stress levels, a kind of idea of hopelessness for the future, and the children are not getting anywhere, or the children are being abused, and the behavior looks like it's something you could call ADHD. Well, this is a mass hypnosis. This is but it's not that. It's look at these social conditions under which people are being forced to live.
That's that kind of, I almost, always when we're talking about this like this, and sometimes it's like the hypnosis, the veil is off, and you can connect it to real life, see that is injustice and stuff like that. But let me be the devil's advocate for a short minute here.
Go ahead, yeah.
So one challenge with that kind of perspective is that there's really nobody responsible to address. Hey, the planet is dying. What are we going to do? Everything's connected. Where are you going to pull in some kind of thing? It doesn't make sense. It's at least we're doing something. What are we going to do? Sit about talking about how the unemployment causes divorces. It's impossible to find a defining line of what's the problem. So I'm just feeling powerless.
Yes.
I can't. No, I don't even know where to start to do something.
Well, the first thing is it's very good devil's advocate, that, Johnny. Yeah, I agree with you. The serious point for me is that there are times when I think most of us have felt like that. Think, what can we do in the light of all this corporate kind of capitalism and so on and so forth? And I need to be reminded that I'm not going to do much on my own. I can do some things on my own, but I really need to be connected to others. And part of your podcast, I think, is to keep that and not to underestimate the power of conversation. It's not a kind of band-aid.
No.
It's part and parcel of keeping a dialogue going that is generative, relational, humanizing, in whichever context. And that's got its own value. In terms of social activism, for example, people do that in their own way when they've got the passion to do it. There's nothing worse than thinking, oh, I should be a member of this. I ought to be more involved in that. I need to be against the wind farms. I need to be. You could overwhelm yourselves with what you should do. Talking about me, and I think when I look at what I actually do is that I join political movements that I think are going to make a contribution. I try to get engaged in conversations with people who disagree with me
Mm.
in a way that keeps the conversation open.
Mm.
But I've given up being down on myself for not doing more, because I'm doing what I think I can do, and it's at a local level, and it's, you know, it's through DM25 is the organization I belong to, and Psychologists for Social Change. But my involvement is more supportive in that, and there's a Black Lives Matters movement in the family therapy world here in the UK, which I've nominally supported, because there's only so much you can do with your time.
Yeah.
And I think people should not feel that when they go home at night after they've had an 8-hour or 9-hour shift in social work or psychiatric care, should not feel guilty if they can't go to that political meeting about climate change.
Mm.
I think the ones that are up for it and are able to absolutely support that 100%. But I don't think we should we should punish ourselves because there's always another issue. There's always a bigger organizational thing, and we need each other to take action. Can you do it on our own? I don't think.
Yeah. So you were talking about being overwhelmed. So I was thinking, can you be underwhelmed? But overwhelmed.
Yes, you can. You can be underwhelmed. Yeah.
What's that?
Well, I think that's when you become, I was going to use the word pummeled, but when you become kind of constantly bombarded with the awfulness that's happening in Afghanistan or Belarus, or immigrants coming through Poland this morning talking about that, get turned away. What can sometimes happen is you turn off.
Yeah.
And you lose that sense of the awfulness of it, because you've heard so much.
You get numb.
It just keeps happening. You become numbed, is a good word. And I think that's as dangerous as getting completely over the top. I think it's that's where I think our conversational contexts are very important. There's one thing I would say. In the period of lockdown that we talked about at the beginning here, a lot of people I met with on supervision and in workshops, but mainly supervision through Zoom, said how much they really missed the opportunity to be, like you said earlier, in the same space, to reflect together, but to be supportive of one another physically in the same space.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is that if we don't do that, then the language of linearity, of objectification, as Michael Witt used to say, thingification, which is a funny word.
Yeah, thingification.
Gets a stronger hold, as does underwhelmed. It's a stronger hold, because we don't keep attending to the actuality of what's happening. So it's a balance, I think, for me.
I was thinking about the kind of dimension of distance to what, well, you might, when you get in a vulnerable place, instinctively want to move back to feel safe.
Yeah.
And the further back you go, the less human you become.
Yeah.
And sometimes it kind of becomes some kind of paradox that when you're really professional, you really don't go through the emotions. You kind of like the analytic, smart intervention. And you don't want to go too close, because sometimes you can lose yourself when you become a part of the family, or depressed like the therapist.
Yeah, exactly.
So the group or other the people that share the same kind of challenges can regulate the kind of distance that seems appropriate in that context, well, when we're not alone. when you're alone, you also have to face your own demons. Well, wow, that's too scary for me, because I'm like that.
Yeah, and it reminds me, and of course it depends on the function that you're trying to perform. So Henry Marsh's book, Do No Harm, is about a brain surgeon, his life as a brain surgeon. And in the book, he's talking about the need to be connected to his colleagues in ways that are sometimes quite challenging, and they have a lot of dark humor and so on and so forth, and they challenge each other, but they really feel they're up for the job that they're going to do, which is intricate brain surgery. But when they're doing the brain surgery, while they're aware of the humanness of the patient, they're focused in so much on the intricacies of that technique, of that operation, that they're obviously in a position where they're focused on that. They're not focused on whether they're upset about this person. That'd be a disaster. So it's very much, where our intimacy is relevant and useful for the job that we're doing, and where the intimacy becomes something that's highly irrelevant. You
don't want a doctor. You don't want a doctor who says, "I'm so scared. I'm gonna make something happen that you won't survive." I can feel it. Can you feel it too?
No. That's it. That's it. So it's back to that whole idea of trying to connect with the context in which we feel we're working.
Yeah.
And sometimes with families, that means keeping a kind of intellect. Sometimes you have to be quite formal and kind of matter of fact and blah, blah, blah. And other times you need to be playful, or you need to be humorous and so on. And you're always measuring, how does this connect with these people in the room? That's our job. We improvise.
Yeah.
On the basis of all the stuff that we've studied. I mean, but that's what keeps it alive, actually.
Yeah.
Because if we didn't improvise, it would be boring.
Yeah. But isn't that? I think of reading a book about creativity. I thought it was really interesting, because it's hard to write about improvisation without giving it a concept that somebody is supposed to follow, and then it's not improvisation. So
be spontaneous. So be spontaneous paradox, the usual one. Yeah, exactly.
Be spontaneous. Now I get it.
Yeah.
Be creative.
Be creative. Yeah. And of course, I hate that terminology. There's a term in the English therapy scene, the creative therapies. And you think, well, wait a minute, does that mean that all the other therapies are by definition uncreative?
Yeah.
I mean, the key thing is co-creativity. You and I know that. What is creative in our job, and I think a lot of our lives, is what's created between us. Let me finish with this little story from last night, if I may.
Yeah.
Right. So, and this is in our village, we have lots of people with different alliances and friendships and neighborly things, and there can be tensions that emerge, about boundaries, or who built the wall and it's obstructing this view or that view. And and there's two things that help to counteract those things. One is having a meal with everybody together, a kind of Babette's feast approach, right? and the other is music.
Yeah.
And when people get together and do that, it's amazing how these petty tensions just seem to float out the window. So there's something about needing to create contexts in our practice where there's a feeling that you can work with the tensions, they're not going to overwhelm people. And that means that we have to improvise in order to create that setting in which something useful and different can happen. And that's what happened last night with the music playing, with French people and non-French people playing together. And tensions just go.
Wow. Kind of dissolves.
I think that was a good Harley and Anderson.
Yeah. But while you're sitting in your own separate houses, you're kind of making these stories about the other who's really not the.
That's right. And you can fall in love with those stories. I mean, Chiquin was right. That's one of the things that we've been talking about in this discussion, is that the vulnerability the experience of vulnerability as a therapist goes along with that little kind of reflective voice that says, don't fall in love with your vulnerability. Jacquin used to say, don't fall in love with your hypothesis. You know, you get an idea that this person is that kind of person. If you get fixed into that, chances of a shift in the relationship become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. So you need to always have that. Why am I so wound up about this person? Why do I think that's the only view of that person? And it's that training in systemics that I think stays with us over the years, hopefully. But we lose it. You lose it.
Yeah. It's okay to lose the feeling that creativity has gone and locked itself in a room and you don't know where the key is.
Yes.
But maybe it's the way of accepting that that's also a way you can experience life. And then something might happen when you're fighting that you're trying to be creative, and then you kind of just turn.
Doesn't work.
So I look at the clock and time's just flying away. I have something that kind of I want to, before we end this talk, just to stop with, because while we've been talking now, I've been thinking about the word creativity, because you have that, you choose that word in your book, and we have tried to find ways of understanding that in different dimensions. So this is just happening now. We're waiting for a question to show up, really exposing some kind of moment of potential and a bit of nervous. Something is about to happen. I found that when you feel safe, that's a really vibrant life, curiosity, and you take the chance to say something and hope you will land right. So I'm thinking about the position of asking questions, and you know, while I've been talking with you today, a lot of the questions that showed up, you answered them before I had the chance to ask the questions. So I had to kind of like let them go. That's I won't find any better answer than that. So the question I have to lose my connection that was important, because what's happening now is what I'm really interested in. The curiosity that kind of finds its own way, bumping in between us. So I was thinking that to find context where you can ask a question and you're kind of searching for a balance of safety and new territory. So a lot of that, to me, that's where some kind of creativity can show up. So how do you, let me put it like this. There are a lot of questions that didn't show up in this talk. And as soon as you ask a question, you collapse into a story about that answer. So this is maybe just a question that won't be able to be to find an answer to, but what are the questions that we're missing? What how come I have the sense that I'm not talking about this conversation, I'm talking in general, when we're fighting with life's biggest challenge, when somebody can't find a way even to be friendly to themselves, and even harder to others. They don't feel like almost human in themselves. Or a society that is not, you don't feel like you belong to the society. This is not my world. So what are the questions? The answers has to come, but the engagement is what are the questions that are missing? You know, we never had so much information that we have now, how to eat, exercise, have sex, be parents. Still, we seem to go into this pattern of suffering and dividing. So what kind of questions are we missing?
And I think the questions are, I think it's a very good question. What questions are we missing? And for me, the questions are about what it takes to have a valid, worthwhile human experience. What is necessary?
What is it?
But what is necessary? And years ago, um, I was working as a social worker in Edinburgh, and my colleague was a gay man, and it was at a time when AIDS was a real killer. Okay,
Yes.
and he got AIDS,
Mm.
and I remember us drinking a bottle of whiskey between us one night, and I asked him, "What is it that has mattered in your life most?" And he said, "It's relationship." This is to me, when you pare it right back, if people have a sense of connection with others, a cause, um, but particularly the experience of being in relationship. I mean, I think it was Bruce Wampold who said that the biggest killer in the Western world is isolation, loneliness.
Mm.
You know, besides heart disease and obesity and all the rest of it.
Mm.
And I don't think we can escape from that. We are fundamentally social beings.
Mm.
We need connection, and it's like the water the fishes swim in. And I think when we live in a world where there's a sense of being acquisitive, acquiring more money, a bigger house, that somehow is going to result in feeling more contented or more absorbed in life. I think for a lot of people, that's a total illusion. It's not the same as saying to people who are poor, you can be poor and happy, because we talked about that earlier, and that's a let-out clause for doing nothing.
Mm.
But I think it's Eric Fromm, who I also like reading his writings in the later part of my career, who talks about the kind of automaton. He called him man because it was written in the 60s, but where we divorce ourselves from experiential value and put a monetary value and things. So I mean, those are rather grand responses, but I think to me, what counts is when we really value the connections we have with others, or we're absorbed in something like the podcast, that has its own vitality, and that really matters alongside, changing the world.
Great.
Both
So,
kind.
I love that experiential value. I will sit with that. That was nice. So, as full I am of more questions, I also have to respect that you probably have something else to do and the listeners have been with us for a long time now. So I'm thinking we kind of at the end of the last song for this conversation, Jim. So before we close, I really appreciate. I feel connected to you. While just even though we're sitting in different
yeah. It feels very mutual,
Yeah. So I was just wondering if somebody becomes curious about learning more about your ways of viewing. So you have these books you've written. I know in Sweden we have at least 2 books in that are translated. And you were saying something about you writing something now.
Yeah, I'm writing it. It's very interesting. Just very, very briefly, I'm writing a book for a German publisher, and they want me to write about meeting with children and young people. But the interesting thing is they don't want it to be a big book. They want only 14,000 words. So it's a small book that people can pick up and read in 1 or 2 goes because they're busy practitioners. So it goes right back to our earlier conversation when we were talking about how do you use language to connect your ideas with a wide audience who might not be necessarily trained in all that systemic jargon and history, all of which is relevant, but it's not necessarily what's necessary, to connect to a wider audience. It can be a stimulus for people to go and read. So that's what I'm doing now, and it's about halfway done, and it's like a trying to condense into a small package things that I've found useful. So I'm quite enjoying that.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah,
will it be translated in more languages, or is it basically?
I don't know. It's obviously I'll write it in English and then it'll be translated into German. So we might try and get an English, publisher at some point as well. But I'll see how it turns out. Because
we'll see how
it's an interesting project.
So, and is there some? Are you? Is it, if you want to get connected with you, are you interested in people connecting to you? Or,
absolutely.
How do one go about to connect with you if one becomes curious about?
I'd be more than happy if people have questions or the criticisms or different points of view. I'd welcome them, and people can just, I think, probably do it through an email, maybe start. Yeah. And you have my email address.
So is it okay if I put it under the?
Yeah.
So if somebody wanted to continue to talk with you, there's the email address, and
yes,
we'll see where that leads.
Yeah, it's the way to keep the conversation alive, and if people would like to do that, I'd be more than happy to hear from them. But it's been really enjoyable seeing you again, Johnny. And remember the last time, wasn't it, in Benk's house?
We were playing
guitar.
Yeah,
so
that was nice.
Let's do that again sometime.
Yeah, let's do that again. And this was really music for me too, we just with words. It was a great time, and I'm gonna have a happy Friday today, just going around and letting these things echo in my head.
Me too. So, thank you very much for the questions. They're really stimulating. Thank you. Yeah. Good.
Nice.
Bon weekend.
Bon weekend. That's how you say it.
Yeah.
Bye bye.